I'm JD, welcome to Together, and once again, a very thrilling episode with my friend, Bill Mew. Bill, we spoke about the work by Max Schrems, and I am a fan of what he does, and I'm impressed about the results that he's able to achieve. And my question to you is that enough?
Well, we need to give Max an enormous amount of credit about what he has achieved. Certainly, the overturning of Privacy Shield is a massive rebuke to the Americans and some of the rather casual attitude that they've taken with our privacy, not to say a fair amount of mass surveillance. In that ruling, he also managed to give the Irish regulator a good kick up the backside and get them moving. And hopefully that sets as an example to most of the rest of the regulators. So maybe we need to cast our eyes a little bit further beyond Max, because he's just one guy, and there are others out there. I mean, I'm fairly active on a lot of the privacy fronts, either supporting Max, working with others, and helping bring litigation. But we still need the regulators to do stuff. And the Irish regulator has need a bit of a kick up the arse, and maybe some of the others do as well, because I think in the last short while, we've seen what had seemed very impressive numbers in terms of fines for the likes of BA and Marriott, cut down by about 90%.
That's a lot. If you just look at what Marriott themselves had accrued for this particular fine, they accrued 99 million. So that was their assumption about the fine that they would get in their annual report for 2019. And it's reduced to 18.4?
Both that and the BA fines were reduced to of the order of 20 million. And that it's sent a signal to some that has been interpreted as meaning we're going to go easy on companies that are in the tourism and transportation business because they're struggling during the COVID crisis. But it's interpreted more widely by others to potentially mean that the regulators haven't really got any teeth and aren't really particularly serious about enforcement. And if you look broadly at the UK regulator, in the last 18 months or so, it has handed out fines totaling about 3.2 million. Something like 2 million is still outstanding and hasn't been paid, which is about 60% of all the penalties, or 68% even. So we've got something not working quite right here. And obviously there are only certain fines that you're ever going to be able to collect, because some of the fines against call centers that are doing dummy calls and a whole lot of other different things, you may well find that by the time you find the company, they've gone into liquidation deliberately and they've set up somewhere else under a different name or whatever. So they're always going to be elusive. But we do need for the bigger corporations out there, and the likes of EasyJet and Marriott and BA and a lot of Equifax and others, all of whom have had various different transgressions. These aren't fly-by-night companies. They're not going to disappear overnight and set up somewhere else. And therefore, we can expect them to abide by the regulations. And indeed, they have an obligation to stick to the law. And we should be able to have some confidence in our regulator to do a level of enforcement.
Well, I fully agree with you on that, Bill. And what I am seeing is that there is an interesting mix happening at the moment. At the one hand, we say, well, GDPR is there to make sure that abuse of privacy does not pay off. There's a very high fine, and there can be recurring fines. It's not a one-time payoff. And if you keep having those issues, we will be back with you. On the other hand, we see the national interest. We see that at the moment very strongly in the UK. We see that in Ireland as well. I assume that we will also see something similar in the Netherlands, because we see some investigation into the so-called digital twins in the financial sector, the debt collectors. And a lot of that has been moved to the Netherlands because the Privacy Act in the UK, which was long before GDPR, already prohibited such practices. And I assume that when we see a similar thing, the national interest, well, when we give that company a big fine, we might either lose their headquarters or we might have to support them in other ways, like with the tourism and travel industry. How do you see that growing, Bill?
what I think we need to do is to avoid either a situation where enforcement is seen as such a joke that people don't take GDPR seriously and don't take privacy seriously. Obviously, the fine and the fear of the regulator shouldn't be the only reason you abide by the law and the only reason you actually take care of your customers' data, because you're being entrusted that, and that's part of your trusted brand status, and therefore you've got a lot to lose other than a fine, and we can come on to talk about some of that. So we don't want the regulation and the enforcement to be seen as so weak that people don't take the regulation seriously. And at the same time, we don't want to see a level of regulatory arbitrage where you find people trading off one regulator against another. Obviously, the data regulators that you mentioned, the data aggregators and the digital twins that you mentioned earlier, had been based in the UK. And because the UK acted in advance of GDPR in enforcing its own really quite strong privacy regulations around which much of GDPR was actually based.
Exactly.
It meant that a number of these firms had previously moved from the UK to the Netherlands and elsewhere in order to avoid that regulation. And now that it's Europe-wide with GDPR, they find themselves under that umbrella and facing a potential fine and a little bit of regulatory trouble. So there should be enforcement, and it should be relatively even across the entire European Union. And hopefully that will remain consistent with a level of equivalence with the UK after Brexit. So we want the enforcement and we want a level of equivalence.
That is definitely in the interest of all of us. And I agree that unity between the UK and the European Union should remain, because a large bloc basically working around the same rules will eventually change the likes of Facebook. And now that I have mentioned Facebook very spontaneously, what I'm concerned about is we see that now they're a bit careful with handing out the big fines and being really aggressive. There are gray terms of 9 months implemented, etc. And if we then transfer that to the likes of Facebook, who basically from the beginning of GDPR already tried to either stay below the radar screen or find the edges or don't care at all, what precedent is that giving to companies like Facebook?
I think we're already seeing a level of grandstanding by the likes of Facebook, because following the Max Schrems arrangement, where Facebook were told that they actually had to abide by GDPR and they had to abide by the law just as everyone else does, they announced that this would make life impossible for them in Europe and that they were considering withdrawing from Europe. That is a level of unreasonable grandstanding on their part, because actually if they want to do business in Europe, they need to abide by the laws that exist here. So please don't try and pull that one. What remains to be seen is the extent to which the Irish regulator, now that it's been given a bit of a kick up the backside, will actually pursue them. And it has a number of outstanding cases against Facebook that it needs to bring. But with the fines being so drastically reduced and with enforcement being in question, much of the impetus in terms of putting on a cape and acting as the Cape Crusader to hold these people to account is now falling to class action lawsuits and some of the legal firms. And I've been reasonably closely involved with several different groups bringing claims. And I'm entirely supportive of them doing this because it gives consumers a level of compensation and redress. And in the absence of effective enforcement by the regulator, well, somebody's got to hold these people to account.
That's definitely very important, Bill, because otherwise we've seen that in the past, the so-called self-regulation does not work, right? That's, from my perspective, crystal clear. And now we have to make sure that the regulation we finally have actually enforces compliance, and that the companies who stick with it, who follow the rules, are rewarded by their customers, because that's also very important. The two things that we have to keep in mind here.
Yes, but even with the sort of litigation we're starting to see, it still shouldn't be all about the fear and the fines and the litigation. There is a massive benefit to brands by doing the right thing, because for years, companies have sought to have the real nirvana, which having a trusted brand status. And for many, many years, trusted brand meant that you had a Porsche and you associated a level of trust with that brand, that it would go so fast and it would perform like this or whatever, as opposed to a Trabant, where you had a different level of trust associated in that particular brand. You would trust that it probably wouldn't work. And therefore, brands have, for a very, very long time, sought to achieve the nirvana of trusted brand status. It is absolutely bonkers for any of them to take risks with their customers' data, because the ability to lose that trusted status overnight if you do the wrong thing is there, and it has been seen time and time again. So it should not be the fear of enforcement and regulation, not be the fear of litigation. It should be a genuine interest that the companies and the brands have in doing the right thing, in achieving and sustaining that trusted brand status.
Bill, thank you. That brings us to a very, very strong closure of this episode. I'm already looking.
My conclusion there is the real Cape Crusader is the consumer, because consumers will make the decisions, because consumers will choose trusted brands.
Perfect, Bill. This consumer power is not yet deployed enough, and that's what we are working on. Thank you, Bill. Let's talk soon.
Good to speak.